My name's Sue Clarke. I'm a Detective Chief Superintendent with Lancashire Police. I'm a head of the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network. I've been in the police for about 29 years now, and most of that time been working with vulnerable people either as a detective or as a community officer. So my last 12 to 18 months has been as head of the Violence Reduction Network. And in Lancashire, that's a team that's made up of about 20 partners from across the spectrum, really, from schools to probation, children's social care, youth offending. So we're trying to work in with our communities within Lancashire just to look at the issues and the underlying issues and the causes of serious violence in Lancs.
Thanks for that, Sue. And just to continue, most of you will know who I am, Graham Goulden, a former police officer. I worked as a chief inspector with the Violence Reduction Unit in Scotland. And today we're going to, I've been asked to talk to Sue about domestic abuse in general, but particularly during this period of lockdown within COVID-19. We're going to do another talk with some other people around prevention, looking at men's role in prevention. That will come after this conversation. But I think, for me, as a police officer, when I joined the police, domestic abuse was, if we attended a domestic abuse call, we just told people to be quiet. We didn't really understand the issues behind the call. We didn't understand the nature of abuse. So when I look back on my early years in the police service, I feel quite ashamed. But that's the person I was, that's the knowledge that I have. And the knowledge that I have now is completely different. Domestic abuse is a badge of shame on society, full stop. We'll never have peace on our streets until we have peace in the home, full stop. Because we know what happens in the home with young people being exposed to violence and how that can, not always, but it can play out in future situations. And lots of the backstories of issues we have in society, domestic abuse will often be part of that person's backstory, gang issues, a whole range of issues. So domestic abuse is something we need to grip tightly as not just as a police organisation or a violence reduction unit, but I think society needs to get more involved. Sue, well, what's your thoughts on at this moment in time? What are we seeing around domestic abuse?
I mean, I can speak, obviously, I've seen national headlines that says there's been an increase in domestic violence, and I know from the other countries, so China, Italy, etc., there's a significant increase in domestic abuse. I've seen the national headlines around that in the UK. I have to say, I can only really speak with conviction around my own force area, Lancashire, that at the moment, although we've seen a slight increase, that isn't as marked as other areas. And I've checked this out with the domestic abuse providers only this week, and we're quite concerned that because that violence is now, people are in their homes ostensibly for the whole 24-hour period, other than whatever every time they might get outside, is that is now hidden behind closed doors. And I say that with obviously with a lack of data and evidence in front of me, but I'm going off my own professional judgment of a number of years working in this area, and also that of other services. So my concern is what's going to happen when lockdown is lifted, and will we look back and say, did we fail to take some real strident steps to try and get people speaking to us, because services are there, they're still there, the police are still there, the police are still responding to domestic abuse. There's a bit of anecdotal feedback that people think the police are only now going out to COVID-related calls, etc. That's absolutely not the case. We're still there, we still want people to call, and I think I have a real concern that people aren't doing that for a number of their own reasons. Maybe it's an inability because of the coercion that they're living under, or is it a misbelief that we're not going to respond? And some of that, I obviously want to stress and emphasise during this conversation that we're having, Graham, that we need people to call, whether it's about themselves or whether it's about their neighbours, friends, family, etc.
Yeah, I think we'll touch on lots of these points. I think, yeah, we've seen the spread of this virus around the world. We've also seen the spread from countries who've talked about increases in demand for services, increases in cost of police. I think in the last few weeks, we've seen a doubling in domestic killings. in the UK, with 13 women have been killed and 4 children have been killed by an abusive partner. And let's get it right out from the start, that when we're talking about domestic abuse, we're talking about anybody can be a victim of domestic abuse.
Yeah.
That's what we're not just going to focus on female victims or male victims, but let's be brave enough to, let's talk about all victims, but let's be brave enough to recognise where the risk is when it comes to domestic abuse. We know that in Scotland annually, 60,000 domestic abuse calls in Scotland. 80% of these calls are male perpetrators and female victims. We know that most guys in this world don't commit abuse, and the next chat we'll have with a couple of men, colleagues of mine, we'll talk about men's role in prevention. But some helplines have been seeing a 120% increase. With that on The Guardian yesterday, talked about a big increase in some helplines being used by people in these abusive relationships. And we're in this period of isolation. It's like government sanctioned isolation. It's the perfect storm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you agree? And what's your thoughts on that?
One of my colleagues who is on our Violence Reduction Network, she's a head teacher, and we utilise Operation Encompass, the early warning notification to schools that the police have been out. So she's saying she's seeing more Encompass notifications come into school than they would ordinarily get, and I suppose it's emphasising that people are still receiving these notifications, and school will absolutely do the best to check the welfare of that child just the way that they would if they were at school. As I said earlier, we've not seen that dramatic increase that's reported in the national press, which actually I'm concerned about in its own right, because there may very well be a reason for that.
Yeah.
So absolutely, I concur with what you say, that this is a societal thing. It should be a priority for all of us in a caring society, and the fact that families may be struggling at this point, we need to share that burden and work out really ways of getting the messages to people that they must seek help, and there's help there for them, even if they don't want to contact the police, which I sometimes understand the ramifications of that seem massive to people, but nevertheless, public safety and the safety of children is a real concern. And what's going to happen when they go back to school? Is that trauma suddenly start having an impact? And how are we all, as a society, how are we going to manage this? Because it's all our problem, really.
I think that's a good point. So, I'm a believer in campaigns. I think campaigns have got a real opportunity to raise awareness. We shouldn't have to wait for the increase in calls or the increase in demand. What's your view on how campaigns can be used to communicate to victims, survivors, that business as usual, we need you to get in touch with us? What's your view on that?
I mean, if you look at other public health campaigns, so the years and years ago, the sort of drink driving health campaigns, the smoking in public stuff, there's been some really positive examples of public campaigns and impacting on behaviour. So I think if we use that as an evidence base, that's worked, and domestic abuse should be as abhorrent as you've identified, Graham, in terms of public opinion. So I do think there's some real gains to be made with a sort of strident national public campaign that we would absolutely get behind in order to get those messages out.
I think it's we're all having at this moment in time, the whole country's having a public health discussion every night in front of the television, and what we've seen from our public health experts at the start of this was their need to communicate, to inform the public about what was going on around the world. So that for me is this idea of we need to communicate to society what is going on. There's a campaign, I believe, in South Yorkshire, which looks at who's pulling your strings.
Yes, I've seen that.
We have local campaigns, national campaigns, and campaigns are really good in my view, for communicating to those people who've been affected by these issues. We're here, we want to support, but it's important. I think these campaigns are used to target people around victims and around perpetrators. What role do you see for society in the prevention of issues such as domestic abuse?
I see very much that it's time to myth bust that it's what goes behind closed doors is other people's business. When you have worked a lot with domestic violence perpetrators, when you speak to them, so for example, I did that very thing about 3 or 4 months ago. We were running a perpetrator program, and I said to these group of men, how many of you witnessed domestic abuse as a child? And every one of them put their hand up. And I said, can you remember it? And quite a couple, but one in particular, a guy who I remember, he kind of went like that, and he cringed. It was like a gut reaction to kind of imagine me, as if I can imagine him sitting on the stairs at home, listening to what's going on, whether it's mother or father subject to the abuse. It obviously had an impact, and they all said, we're now becoming the person that we hated and feared when we were growing up. And I think this kind of stuff, perhaps because it's our line of work, we know that and we understand that. But I think society perhaps needs disavowing of some of maybe the myths that, without getting too political about this, longer, harsher sentences. When we're talking about trauma, possibly, I would like to say that perhaps don't have an impact. So society, I think, I'm a firm believer that we should be talking about this like we're doing now to everyone. Because if you don't know this stuff, because it's not, it's not your job to know it, you may very well think that what's going on behind closed doors is someone else's business. But when you know the impact, that's not the case.
So what I think to realise is that, that when we talk to these perpetrators about their behaviour and we start to look at what happened to them in their early years, we're not excusing them for their behaviour.
Absolutely not.
I sometimes say we need to walk and chew gum. And by that, I mean we need to hold people accountable. That needs to be done. But we need to understand why people are behaving in that way. And that's why I think you're right. So it's so important that this is a great opportunity for society to learn. It's what you learn after you think you know all that counts. We need to get people in society. There's so much. This week is National Stalking Awareness Week in the UK. There's so much on social media and the media about stalking and how that can lead to domestic homicide. It's a precursor to issues of homicide in domestic relationships. You're right. So I think campaigns need to be targeting perpetrators. We will arrest you if that happens. Victims, we need you to speak to us. You will be supported. You will be believed, which is important. And it's not your fault. But I think we need to start, how do we communicate to society so that they start to, I think what we're seeing, we're seeing lots of community spirit at this moment in time, food banks, we're seeing people delivering meals, clapping the NHS every Thursday night. We're seeing people are coming together. We're really showing our commonality. But you're right. I still think when domestic abuse, that's a private matter, that's somebody else's business.
Yeah.
But when you talk about all the other issues that we're facing in society, for me, if we had a more informed society, we would have a less victim-blaming society. Do you think victims of abuse feel they won't be believed or they'll be blamed for what's happening to them?
I think they believe, some believe that, and I think that's some of that is borne out by their experience. Let's be honest. As much as I think the media could be more responsible in promoting positive messages about experiences people have had with the criminal justice system, I can't say that everybody has a positive experience, because they don't. Part of that education is about us acknowledging that and being big enough and brave enough to acknowledge when we've got it wrong, and to help our staff learn what they need to learn. And that critical thing is around empathy and compassion. And actually, rather, my colleague, the head teacher I referred to, he calls it bringing your human to work.
Yeah. So
a bit about trauma-informed, which we're hearing a lot around at the moment about trauma-informed practice. We're hearing a lot about adverse childhood experiences, and I know there's a bit of a contention around the ACEs stuff potentially. But if we're talking about trauma, you have to be open to hearing it in order to be able to truly help the person. And that's what I would say, that this is an opportunity that you've identified, Graham, is to say, whilst we're all in lockdown, let's think about others, let's think about their experiences. Because if we think about the abuser, whether it's male or female, as an adult, who's able to take responsibility or either acknowledge their own actions or at some point be held to account for them. But if we don't understand that that starts within the home, when that person was a small child, and that fight or flight response, that sense of fear that they're living under means that your brain develops in a different way, and your reactions develop differently to others. If we don't break this information out to society and communities, it's going to be very difficult to make some really significant headway.
Yeah, I think it's important as well that we help society learn to identify what we mean by abuse, because when we're talking about domestic abuse, we're not just talking about the physical.
No.
But now I know in Scotland and England as well, we have coercive control laws, which which recognise the terror within a controlling relationship. Intimate terrorism is often referred to.
Yep.
And I still meet far too many people in society who don't realise that controlling your partner is against the law. It is against the law. It's and that can be telling them when to wash, who their friends are, how much money they've got in their bank or their pocket. That is against the law. And I think part of doing the knowledge for me is about helping people spot the red flags in their relationship. And then next step is, what do you do? Now you're a police officer, and I'm assuming you would like neighbours, if they hear things going on, to contact the police.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other consideration that we've had this week is that if you're living in a coercive relationship or in a household where there's that fear that you describe, but you're not now going to work, you're not going to meet friends, you're not going out for a drink with your sister or whatever, there might be less prompts to inflame that violent reaction, which doesn't mean to say it's not there. Yeah. It's just that the fact that you're in lockdown means you're not those red flags that you talk about before, perhaps they aren't provoking the reaction. It doesn't mean to say that the person living in that environment feels any safer. It's just they're trying to tread water and keep things on an even keel, probably for themselves, their own safety, that of the children.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a kind of lot that I think from a societal perspective we need to learn about, acknowledge, and take more cognizance of.
Because a lot of victims will manage the situation. They'll accept what's going on. They'll deflect it away. They'll tell neighbours and friends, "I'm okay. Back off. I'm fine." And that's them managing their own safety in many ways. And I think coercive control is a topic that I've really started to learn loads about. It's not just coercive control is not just an argument. We all argue within relationships, but coercive control is a power dynamic, and at play, and victims are losing power to the perpetrator. A friend of mine in America, Leslie Morgan Steiner, has got a lovely TED talk called Crazy Love, and she talks about her experiences as a victim of coercive control. It's well worth a watch. The TED talk Crazy Love by Leslie Morgan Steiner. I won't spoil the ending, but she talks about she isn't the stereotypical domestic abuse victim who is, domestic abuse permeates through all parts of society. And you talked about phoning the police. In my work, I do a lot of training around engaging the public to be active bystanders. And one of the tools that we give them is to defer it to somebody else. If you don't feel you can do it yourself, you defer to somebody else. And that's what we want. Just something's happening in this house, I want the police to come along to deal with that. I also think there's opportunities for bystanders to engage directly with victims and survivors. Because it's hard, it's difficult, it's challenging. It's a friend, a neighbour, a family member. But my experience working in this country, in the United States, suggests that a lot of survivors actually wanted that neighbour, that friend, to say something when the red flags became evident. And what would your advice be to a bystander who had a disclosure from a friend or thought something was going on? What sort of things could they be saying, do you think? I've got some ideas, but what do you think they could be saying to that victim?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to your gut feeling about something. So you're right. I think victims often do want to be asked, and I know that because victims have told me that. and people and survivors have told me that. So the fact that we want you to ask, perhaps people need the tools to be able to have those difficult conversations, because that's, that is if that's not your professional role, that can be tricky, can't it, to have that kind of conversation with someone. And we know that victims and survivors are the best at keeping themselves safe. So they know what the red flags are that provoke and trigger the behaviour that petrifies them and the children. So they know, they are experts at managing that and trying to mitigate it as best they can. Yeah. But as an opportunity, if a friend, a neighbour, a relative asks them directly, I would say that you referred before, Graham, to saying, it's absolutely not your fault. The perpetrator will absolutely have said that you did that because you didn't tidy up, you provoked me because you did this, or he didn't do that. It's absolutely not their fault at all. And whenever that is said, that is absolutely a massive red flag from the perspective of where that individual's coming from. So some kind of narcissistic twist that I can blame you for my behaviour. So absolutely not acceptable. And I would stress that to somebody who's trying to have a conversation. The other thing is that person who may receive that disclosure or partial disclosure isn't on their own. There's kind of all these services, whether local or the National Domestic Violence Hotline helpline. There's a lot of services who will speak to people on the phone, will give them advice. So if someone was watching this and thinking, I'm worried about someone that I know, I don't know how to have that conversation with them, there's absolutely numerous services who they could seek help and advice from prior to perhaps tackling the conversation. But I'd absolutely urge people, if they've got that feeling, you haven't got that feeling for no reason. You've probably had that thought come in your mind that that person is perhaps not in the safest scenario, and you've pushed that thought away, and you've had it again, and you've pushed the thought away because you don't want to interfere, 2, you don't want to upset them or offend them. It comes to the stage where we have to do something, we have to ask.
I think that you've hit it on the head for me. I think a lot of people that we're talking about who see things happening, they think, oh, I'm going to have to solve this problem. No, the responsibility will always lie with the victim survivor, because they need to manage it in their own way and deal with it in their own way. But how powerful would it be, any opportunity to be, this, you didn't deserve that, that wasn't your fault. It's like it's like a big syringe of power going back to that victim, because the power has been taken away by the perpetrator. And our job as society, and any one of us can do this, is to give power back. The first step for me is acknowledge what you've seen and act on your gut, because when your gut says something, it's usually right. And then lean into this issue. Don't walk away from it. Don't say it's not my business. It is your business. That person's a friend, a family member, a work colleague. So this is about friendship for me. So reach out, validate their experience. This wasn't your fault. And you're right, Sue. We can. There's so many organisations out there who are better placed than you and I to respond to that victim. But at least we can refer them to that individual. So I think for me, at this time, and thanks for your input. Just to summarise that, the UK is open for business. We talked about the NHS is open for business for other issues that not COVID related. The same goes for domestic abuse. The police are still there responding to calls. Services are still there responding to calls, doing a fantastic job for male victims, female victims, whoever. And we need to get that out. And I support the campaigns are out there. I want people to get angry about domestic abuse. I want them to put that anger into being part of the solution. And the next time I have a conversation, I'm bringing in two friends of mine, 2 men who are involved in prevention, because whilst I think society as a whole needs to be involved in prevention, there's a specific role, I think, for some men out there, for all men out there, to be part of the solution. Most men don't commit abuse out there, but we need to talk to men about how we can bring them in to be part of the solution around domestic abuse. So thanks for the conversation, Sue, and thanks for all the good work that you and your team are doing. I look forward to meeting you and your team in the future.
Great, thank you.